On a windswept hill in southwestern Louisville, Kentucky, there stands a monument to suffering, a cathedral of the dying, a place where hope came to wither and death came to harvest. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium rises from the landscape like a Gothic fortress, its red brick facade weathered by decades of abandonment, its windows dark and vacant, staring out across the city below like the hollow eyes of the countless souls who drew their final breaths within its walls. This is not simply an abandoned hospital. This is a place where the veil between our world and the next has worn dangerously thin. For over 50 years, from 1910 to 1961, Waverly Hills served as a tuberculosis sanatorium during one of history's most devastating epidemics. Tuberculosis, known by many names throughout history, including consumption and the White Plague, was a merciless killer that showed no discrimination. It claimed the young and the old, the wealthy and the poor, ravaging entire communities and leaving grief in its wake. In Louisville, Kentucky, the situation was particularly dire. The city's location along the Ohio River, with its wetlands and stagnant air combined with industrial pollution, created the perfect breeding ground for Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the bacteria responsible for this deadly disease. At the height of the epidemic in the 1920s and 1930s, Louisville had one of the highest tuberculosis death rates in the entire United States. Desperate for a solution, public health officials established Waverly Hills atop a hill where the prevailing winds and abundant sunshine could aid in treatment. What they created became known as one of the most advanced tuberculosis hospitals in the country. The massive 5-story structure, completed in 1926 at a cost of over $1 million, could house more than 400 patients. Its batwing design allowed for maximum air circulation, and each floor featured solarium spaces where patients could be wheeled out in their beds, regardless of the season, to absorb fresh air and sunlight that doctors hoped would cure their affliction. But Waverly Hills was built to combat an enemy that medical science had not yet learned to defeat. Before the discovery of antibiotic treatment in the 1940s, there was no cure for tuberculosis. Patients arrived at Waverly Hills with hope, but many never left except through the infamous Body Chute, a 500-foot underground tunnel that staff used to discreetly remove the dead so that living patients would not have their morale destroyed by the constant sight of death. The exact number of deaths at Waverly Hills remains a subject of debate and speculation. Some sources claim the number reached as high as $63,000, though this figure is almost certainly exaggerated. More conservative estimates, based on available records and known mortality rates, place the number between 6,000 and 20,000 deaths. Even at the lower estimate, this represents an average of 1 death every other day for over 50 years. At the height of the epidemic, during the worst years of the 1930s and 1940s, some sources suggest that 1 person died every hour. Whether these numbers are precisely accurate or not, one thing is certain: an extraordinary amount of suffering and death occurred within these walls. Today, Waverly Hills is no longer a functioning hospital. It has been transformed into something else entirely, something that draws tens of thousands of visitors each year from around the world. Paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, curiosity seekers, and thrill seekers all make the pilgrimage to what many consider to be one of the most haunted locations on Earth. Television shows including Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, Paranormal Lockdown, and countless others have featured Waverly Hills, capturing what they claim is evidence of supernatural activity within its decaying corridors. Among all the rooms, all the floors, all the spaces within this massive structure, there is one location that stands above all others in its reputation for paranormal activity and dark history. On the 5th floor, just off the old nurses' station, there is a room that has become legendary in the paranormal community. This is room 502, a place where tragedy struck not once, but twice, where nurses allegedly took their own lives in desperation, and where visitors today report overwhelming feelings of dread, disembodied voices commanding them to leave, and encounters with entities that seem trapped in an eternal cycle of anguish. The legend of Room 502 has taken on a life of its own, evolving and growing with each retelling. Some details remain consistent across accounts, while others vary wildly. The truth, as is often the case with legends, lies somewhere in the murky space between documented history and collective folklore. What is certain is that Room 502 has earned its reputation as the most haunted, most cursed space in an already deeply haunted building. To understand why, we must journey back in time to the early 20th century, to an era when tuberculosis was America's deadliest enemy, and Waverly Hills was built as a beacon of hope in the war against this terrible plague. The White Plague. Understanding tuberculosis. Before we can truly understand the horror of Room 502 and the darkness that permeates Waverly Hills Sanatorium, we must first understand the disease that brought this institution into existence. Tuberculosis is not simply a medical condition relegated to history books. It is a disease that has haunted humanity for thousands of years, claiming hundreds of millions of lives throughout human history. Even today, tuberculosis remains one of the top infectious disease killers worldwide, though modern antibiotics have made it treatable in most cases. Tuberculosis is caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which primarily attacks the lungs but can affect other parts of the body, including the bones, brain, and kidneys. The disease spreads through the air when infected. Individuals cough, sneeze, or even speak, releasing tiny droplets containing the bacteria into the environment. This airborne transmission made tuberculosis incredibly contagious, particularly in the crowded, poorly ventilated conditions common in early 20th century cities. The symptoms of tuberculosis are brutal and unmistakable. The disease earned the name consumption because it seemed to consume its victims from within. Patients experienced a persistent, racking cough that grew worse over time. As the disease progressed, they would begin coughing up blood, sometimes in small flecks mixed with sputum, other times in terrifying gushes that left them weak and gasping. Night sweats soaked their bedclothes, forcing them to change multiple times through the darkness. Fever came and went in cycles, leaving victims exhausted and delirious. The disease robbed them of their appetite, and victims wasted away, their bodies growing thin and frail as their strength ebbed. Chest pain made breathing difficult and painful. In the final stages, patients often became bedridden, too weak to stand, drowning slowly in the fluid that filled their diseased lungs. What made tuberculosis particularly insidious was its slow progression. Unlike diseases that killed quickly, tuberculosis could take months or even years to run its course. Patients might experience periods where they seemed to improve, giving them false hope before the disease returned with renewed vigor. This pattern of remission and relapse was emotionally devastating, a cruel cycle that tortured not only the patients, but also their families who watched helplessly as their loved ones slowly deteriorated. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the United States and much of Europe. It showed no mercy, striking people of all ages, though it seemed to have a particular preference for young adults in their prime working years. The disease had a cultural impact that went far beyond its medical devastation. Tuberculosis became romanticized in literature and art, with the pale, wan appearance of consumptive individuals seen as somehow tragic and beautiful. Poets, authors, and artists created works featuring noble characters wasting away from the disease, lending it an air of romanticism that belied the ugly, painful reality of dying from tuberculosis. The bacteria that caused tuberculosis were identified by German physician Robert Koch in 1882, a discovery that earned him the Nobel Prize. This identification was a crucial step forward in understanding the disease, proving that it was caused by a specific microorganism rather than bad air, heredity, or moral failing, as had been previously believed. However, identifying the cause of tuberculosis did not immediately lead to a cure. For decades after Koch's discovery, medical science remained largely powerless against the disease. Without effective pharmaceutical treatment, doctors and public health officials were left with limited options in their fight against tuberculosis. The primary weapons in their arsenal were isolation, fresh air, rest, and nutrition. This approach gave rise to the sanatorium movement, a public health initiative that sought to remove tuberculosis patients from crowded urban environments and place them in facilities specifically designed to aid in their treatment and recovery. The theory behind sanatorium treatment was relatively simple. Fresh air was believed to help heal diseased lungs, so patients were exposed to outdoor air as much as possible, regardless of weather conditions. Sunlight was thought to kill bacteria, so heliotherapy or sun therapy became a standard treatment. Patients received nutritious food, particularly diets rich in protein, vitamins, and calories, to help their bodies fight the infection. Bed rest was prescribed to conserve the patient's strength. In essence, the sanatorium approach aimed to create optimal conditions for the body to heal itself. In Louisville, Kentucky, the situation with tuberculosis was particularly dire. In 1900, the city had the highest tuberculosis death rate in America. The city's geographical location contributed significantly to this crisis. Louisville sits at the edge of a large floodplain along the Ohio River. The wetlands, combined with the humid climate, stagnant air, and industrial pollution from the growing city, created an environment where Mycobacterium tuberculosis could thrive and spread with devastating efficiency. Nearly 20% of all deaths in Louisville were attributed to tuberculosis during the peak of the epidemic. The crisis demanded action. In 1906, the Louisville Anti-Tuberculosis Association formed the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital with the specific mission of establishing a sophisticated treatment center dedicated to fighting this plague. They needed a location that offered the fresh air and sunlight that were considered essential for treatment. They needed space for a large facility that could accommodate the growing number of patients, and they needed to find this location far enough from the city center to reduce the risk of infection spreading to the general population while remaining accessible to patients and staff. The board found their answer on a hill in southwestern Jefferson County, a place that would become known as Waverly Hills, and where one of America's most notorious haunted locations would be born from the suffering and death of thousands. Birth of a sanatorium. Early years: 1883–1926. The land that would eventually become home to one of America's most notorious haunted locations began its story in a far more innocent manner. In 1883, Major Thomas H. Hayes purchased a sprawling tract of land in what is now the Waverly Hills neighborhood of Louisville, Kentucky. Major Hayes envisioned this property as his family's homestead, a place removed from the growing bustle and pollution of downtown Louisville, where his children could grow up, surrounded by fresh air and natural beauty. However, Major Hayes quickly encountered a practical problem. The property was located quite far from any established schools, and he was unwilling to have his daughters travel long distances for their education. Demonstrating the kind of self-sufficient thinking that was common among prosperous families of that era, Major Hayes decided to establish his own one-room schoolhouse right on the property. He hired a young woman named Lizzie Lee Harris to serve as the teacher. Miss Harris proved to be more than just an educator. She was a woman of literary tastes, and she held a particular fondness for the Waverley novels written by Sir Walter Scott, the famous Scottish historical novelist. These romantic tales of Scottish history and adventure had captured the imagination of readers throughout the English-speaking world. Miss Harris, enchanted by these stories, and perhaps seeking to bring a touch of that romantic Scottish flavor to the Kentucky hills, named her little schoolhouse Waverly School, using the British spelling with 2 E's. Major Hayes appreciated the peaceful, lyrical quality of the name. It evoked images of rolling hills, gentle breezes, and pastoral tranquility. He adopted the name not just for the school, but for his entire property, dubbing it Waverly Hill. For several years, this name graced a quiet, pleasant property where children learned their lessons and families lived their lives in relative peace and comfort, far removed from the crowding and disease that plagued urban areas. But in downtown Louisville, a crisis was brewing that would eventually reach even this peaceful hilltop. Tuberculosis was sweeping through the city with devastating force. The disease thrived in Louisville's particular environmental conditions. The city's location in a river valley meant that air circulation was often poor. Industrial smoke and pollution hung heavy in the atmosphere. The wetlands along the Ohio River provided perfect breeding grounds for bacteria. Crowded living conditions in working-class neighborhoods allowed the disease to spread rapidly from person to person. By the turn of the 20th century, Louisville had earned the grim distinction of having the highest tuberculosis death rate in the entire United States. The crisis could not be ignored. Medical professionals, public health officials, and concerned citizens recognized that dramatic action was needed. In 1906, the Louisville Anti-Tuberculosis Association took the lead in addressing the epidemic by forming the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital. This board had a clear mission: to establish a proper sanatorium dedicated to treating tuberculosis patients, a facility that would incorporate the latest thinking about how to combat this terrible disease. The sanatorium movement, which had gained traction in Europe and was spreading across America, was based on a philosophy that combined medical treatment with environmental factors. Sanatoriums were typically built in locations that offered abundant fresh air and sunlight, away from the smoke and pollution of cities. The prevailing medical wisdom held that these environmental factors, combined with proper nutrition, bed rest, and careful medical supervision, offered the best hope for tuberculosis patients to recover, or at least to live longer, more comfortable lives. The Board of Tuberculosis Hospital searched for a suitable location and found it on Major Hayes's property. The hill offered excellent air circulation, with prevailing winds that would sweep across the facility. Its elevation provided good drainage and avoided the lowland dampness that was thought to exacerbate respiratory disease. The location was far enough from downtown Louisville to provide the isolation that quarantine required, yet close enough that patients, staff, and supplies could reach it with reasonable ease. The board purchased the land from the Hayes family, retaining the name Waverly Hill, though the spelling would eventually shift to drop the second E, becoming Waverly Hills. Both spellings appeared in documents for years before Waverly became standardized. Construction began in 1908. The first Waverly Hills Sanatorium was a relatively modest structure, a 2-story wooden building with open-air pavilions. The design reflected the sanatorium philosophy, with much of the space open to the elements to allow for the fresh air that was considered crucial for treatment. The building could accommodate 40 to 50 patients. It cost $25,000 to construct, equivalent to roughly $800,000 in today's currency. Because tuberculosis affected people of all economic classes but hit the poor particularly hard, the facility was established as a public health institution that would provide free treatment regardless of a patient's ability to pay. On July 26, 1910, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium officially opened its doors to receive its first patients. The facility represented hope in the fight against tuberculosis, a place where the sick could receive care and where, it was hoped, many would recover and return to their normal lives. The staff worked diligently to create an environment conducive to healing, implementing the fresh air therapy that was the cornerstone of tuberculosis treatment at that time. But hope alone cannot cure disease, and fresh air could not stop the relentless advance of tuberculosis through Louisville's population. Within just a few years of opening, Waverly Hills was overwhelmed. The original capacity of 40 to 50 patients proved woefully inadequate. By 1911, shortly after opening, city officials were already making plans to expand. In 1912, facing a continued surge in tuberculosis cases, all tuberculosis patients from Louisville City Hospital were transferred to temporary tent facilities on the Waverly Hills grounds, while construction began on expanded facilities. By December 1912, a new 50-bed hospital building had been completed on the grounds, along with a nurse training school. This expansion reflected the growing recognition that tuberculosis was not a temporary crisis, but an ongoing epidemic that required substantial, long-term infrastructure. In 1914, a children's pavilion was added, providing another 50 beds. This facility served two purposes. It housed children who were sick with tuberculosis, and it also provided a place for the healthy children of tuberculosis patients to live when their parents were too ill to care for them properly. By 1915, Waverly Hills had grown into a substantial complex with a capacity listed at approximately 170 patients representing all stages of the disease. The facility now treated both children and adults, and in keeping with the segregated practices of that era, it maintained separate areas for white and black patients. Yet even this expanded capacity proved insufficient as tuberculosis continued its deadly march through the population. The wooden structures, while functional, required constant maintenance and repair. Wood deteriorated quickly in the humid Kentucky climate, and the open-air design, while beneficial for treatment, exposed the buildings to the elements. Moreover, the need for beds continued to grow. Patients were being turned away because there simply was no room for them, and being turned away from a tuberculosis sanatorium was often a death sentence. The Board of Tuberculosis Hospital made a momentous decision. They would construct an entirely new facility, a massive permanent structure that would represent the most advanced thinking in tuberculosis treatment and hospital design. In March 1924, construction began on what would become the Waverly Hills Sanatorium that stands today. This was to be no ordinary hospital. The new building would be a monument to the fight against tuberculosis, a cathedral of healing that would incorporate cutting-edge medical facilities with architectural features specifically designed to aid in treatment. The design was entrusted to D.X. Murphy and Arthur Loomis, respected architects who specialized in large institutional buildings. They created a structure in the Tudor Gothic Revival style, a massive red brick building with distinctive architectural features. The most notable aspect of the design was its bat-wing shape. This unusual configuration was not chosen for aesthetic reasons, but for its functional benefits. The building was oriented so that its bat-wing structure faced southwest, allowing it to catch the prevailing winds and maximize exposure to sunlight. This meant that fresh air and sunshine, the two elements considered most crucial for tuberculosis treatment, would flow continuously through the corridors and into patient rooms. The building rose 5 stories tall and stretched across 180,000 square feet. It could accommodate more than 400 patients at full capacity, making it one of the largest tuberculosis sanatoriums in the country. Each floor was designed with meticulous attention to the needs of tuberculosis treatment. Patient rooms lined both wings of each floor, and these rooms opened onto solarium spaces, essentially open-air porches that ran the length of the building. Patients could be wheeled out in their beds onto these solariums, where they would spend hours or even entire days and nights exposed to fresh air and sunshine, regardless of the season or weather. Historical photographs show patients bundled in blankets, literally covered in snow during winter months, lying in their beds on these open-air porches while undergoing this fresh air treatment. The facility was designed to be self-sufficient, a necessity given that everyone who lived and worked there had to remain in quarantine to prevent spreading tuberculosis to the outside world. Waverly Hills became its own small city. It had its own zip code and post office. The grounds included vegetable and fruit gardens that provided fresh produce. Livestock was kept to supply milk, eggs, and meat. A water treatment plant ensured clean water. There were laundry facilities, an auto maintenance garage, and workshops for various purposes. The complex included administrative offices, medical laboratories, an X-ray department, operating rooms, a morgue, a cafeteria and kitchen, a library, a barber shop, and even recreational spaces. Staff housing was included so that doctors, nurses, and other workers could live on site. The 5th floor deserves special mention because it would become the center of Waverly Hills' darkest legends. This floor featured a heliotherapy department where patients with tuberculosis of the bone, a particularly devastating form of the disease, received extended exposure to sunlight. The roof was designed with an open patio space where children could play, offering young patients some semblance of normalcy in their lives. The 5th floor also housed 2 nurses' stations, positioned to monitor patients efficiently. Adjacent to these nurses' stations were smaller rooms used for various purposes, including storage, a pantry, a medicine room, and other functional spaces. One of these rooms, designated as Room 502, was a bathroom facility. It was on this floor, in these spaces designed for healing, that tragedy would strike and legend would be born. Construction of this massive facility took 2.5 years and cost over $1 million, an enormous sum for that era equivalent to roughly $17 million in today's currency. The building opened on October 17, 1926, and it was immediately hailed as one of the most modern and well-equipped tuberculosis sanatoriums in the nation. Waverly Hills represented the cutting edge of medical thinking about tuberculosis treatment. It offered not just medical care, but a comprehensive approach that included nutrition, rest, fresh air, sunlight, and careful monitoring. Each patient room was equipped with a telephone and a radio, luxuries that were rare in hospitals of that era. These amenities were not frivolous, but rather reflected an understanding that patient morale was crucial to recovery. The solarium spaces were expansive and well-designed. The facility included everything needed not just for medical treatment, but for creating a functional community where patients and staff could live for extended periods, as many would need to do. As the doors opened to receive patients in October 1926, there was genuine optimism. Here was a facility that could provide the best possible care for tuberculosis patients. Here was a place where medical science and thoughtful design combined to offer real hope in the fight against this terrible disease. The staff was skilled and dedicated. The facilities were state-of-the-art. Everything possible had been done to create an environment where healing could occur. But tuberculosis was a cruel enemy, and despite the best efforts of everyone at Waverly Hills, the disease continued to claim lives at an alarming rate. The treatment options available in 1926, while well-intentioned, were largely ineffective against tuberculosis. Fresh air and sunshine could not cure an infection caused by bacteria. Good nutrition and bed rest could strengthen a patient's body, but they could not eliminate the Mycobacterium tuberculosis that was slowly destroying their lungs. And so, despite the hope and optimism, despite the $1 million facility and the dedicated staff, people continued to die at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. They died in large numbers, day after day, year after year, and their deaths would eventually give rise to the legends that would make Waverly Hills infamous. Life and death. At Waverly Hills. Life at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. during its operational years was a strange existence, removed from the normal world and governed by the rhythms of disease, treatment, and death. For the patients who entered through those Gothic doors, Waverly Hills became their entire world, a world that many would never leave alive. The experience of being admitted to Waverly Hills began with the devastating diagnosis of tuberculosis. Receiving this diagnosis in the 1920s, 1930s, or 1940s was almost like receiving a death sentence. Patients knew they would be separated from their families for an indefinite period. They knew they would miss months or years of their lives, unable to attend weddings, birthdays, or holidays with their loved ones. They knew they would not be permitted to leave the grounds of the sanatorium. They knew that many people who entered Waverly Hills never emerged except as corpses. Upon admission, patients were classified according to the stage of their disease. Approximately 25% of patients admitted were in the early stages of tuberculosis, with relatively limited lung damage and a better prognosis for recovery. About 27% were in the second or intermediate stage, with more significant disease progression. The remaining 47%, nearly half of all admissions, arrived with advanced or late-stage tuberculosis. For these patients, survival was unlikely, and treatment focused more on comfort and symptom management than on cure. Patients were assigned to rooms based on their condition. Those in earlier stages of disease might have some freedom to move about, though always within the confines of the sanatorium. Those in more advanced stages were often bedridden, too weak to walk, spending their days and nights in their rooms or wheeled out onto the solarium porches for fresh air treatment. The daily routine at Waverly Hills centered around rest, nutrition, and exposure to fresh air. Meals were carefully planned to be nutritious and calorie-rich, as many tuberculosis patients suffered from severe weight loss and malnutrition. The sanatorium's kitchen prepared food using ingredients from the on-site farm and gardens when possible. Patients received vitamin-rich foods, particularly those high in vitamin A and ascorbic acid, which were thought to support immune function. Protein-rich foods were emphasized to help maintain body mass and strength. Fresh air treatment was constant. Patients spent much of their time on the open-air solarium porches, regardless of weather conditions. The theory held that fresh air helped heal damaged lungs and that the bacteria causing tuberculosis could not survive well in well-ventilated sunlit spaces. Historical photographs from Waverly Hills show patients lying in their beds on these porches, covered with blankets, and sometimes with snow literally piling up around them during winter storms. This practice seems cruel and unusual to modern eyes, but at the time, it represented the best medical thinking available. Heliotherapy, or sun treatment, was particularly emphasized for patients with tuberculosis of the bone. These patients would be taken to the fifth-floor roof area, where they would be exposed to direct sunlight for extended periods. The ultraviolet light in sunshine was known to have some antibacterial properties, and doctors hoped that exposing diseased areas to sunlight might help kill the tuberculosis bacteria and promote healing. Beyond these basic treatments, life at Waverly Hills involved efforts to maintain patient morale and provide some quality of life. The sanatorium had a library where patients could borrow books. There were recreational activities organized by staff. Patients could listen to the radios in their rooms or use their telephones to speak with family members, though in-person visits were restricted due to quarantine concerns. Religious services were held for those who wanted them. There were spaces where those who were well enough could socialize with other patients, though close contact was discouraged to prevent spreading the infection between patients at different stages of disease. For the staff at Waverly Hills, life was equally isolated. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, and other workers could not leave the grounds during their employment at the sanatorium. They had to say goodbye to their own families and move into staff housing at Waverly Hills, joining the patients in quarantine. Some staff members brought their families to live with them at the sanatorium. Children of staff and patients who were not infected with tuberculosis lived in the children's pavilion, receiving their education on site and growing up in this strange, isolated community. The dedication required of Waverly Hills staff cannot be overstated. They knew when they accepted positions there that they were putting themselves at significant risk of contracting tuberculosis. Despite all precautions, the disease could spread through the air with a single cough. Healthcare workers at tuberculosis sanatoriums had significantly higher infection rates than the general population. Yet these men and women reported to work day after day, caring for the sick, trying to provide comfort and hope, even when they knew that many of their patients would not survive. But alongside the routine care, there was the ever-present reality of death. Despite the fresh air, the sunshine, the nutritious food, and the dedicated medical care, tuberculosis continued to kill with brutal efficiency. In the years before antibiotic treatment became available, there was no cure for tuberculosis. All the treatments offered at Waverly Hills could potentially slow the disease's progression or help patients live longer, more comfortable lives, but they could not eliminate the infection. When conservative treatments failed, doctors at Waverly Hills resorted to more aggressive interventions. These procedures, which would be considered barbaric by today's standards, were desperate attempts to save patients for whom all other options had been exhausted. One such procedure was artificial pneumothorax, where doctors would deliberately collapse a diseased lung by introducing air or gas into the pleural cavity, the space between the lung and chest wall. The theory was that collapsing the lung would allow it to rest and potentially heal. In practice, this procedure was painful, risky, and often ineffective. Another surgical intervention was thoracoplasty, one of the most brutal procedures performed at Waverly Hills. In this operation, surgeons would remove several ribs from the patient's chest wall, typically 7 or 8 ribs. The idea was that removing these ribs would allow the chest cavity to collapse inward, theoretically giving the lungs more room to expand and take in oxygen. The procedure was incredibly traumatic for patients. The mortality rate was staggering, with less than 5% of patients surviving the operation. Those who did survive faced a long, painful recovery and were left with permanent chest deformities. Doctors also performed lobectomies, removing diseased sections of lung tissue, and pneumonectomies, removing an entire lung. Some patients were subjected to experimental treatments such as surgically implanting balloons into their lungs, and then inflating these balloons in an attempt to expand the lungs manually. The desperation underlying these procedures reflects the helplessness that doctors felt when confronted with this disease for which they had no effective treatment. The death rate at Waverly Hills was devastating. While exact numbers are difficult to determine because many early records were lost in the Great Flood of 1937 that inundated Louisville, estimates suggest that between 6,000 and 20,000 people died at Waverly Hills during its decades of operation. During the worst years of the tuberculosis epidemic in the 1930s and 1940s, some accounts suggest that one person died every hour at Waverly Hills, which would mean 24 deaths per day. Whether this specific number is accurate or not, there is no doubt that death was a constant, overwhelming presence. This constant death created a significant problem for the sanatorium administration. Patient morale was recognized as a crucial component of treatment. Doctors believed that patients who maintained a positive mental attitude and hope for recovery had better outcomes. But how could patients maintain hope when they were surrounded by constant reminders of death? How could they remain optimistic when they saw staff wheeling covered bodies out of rooms, when they heard the whispered conversations about who had died overnight, when they noticed that the patient in the bed next to them was suddenly gone? The solution was the Body Chute, though officially it was known simply as the tunnel or the supply tunnel. This structure was built at the same time as the main sanatorium building, extending from the basement level of the hospital down 500 feet to the bottom of the hill where it connected to railroad tracks. The tunnel had two parallel paths. On one side was a stairway that allowed staff to walk up and down. On the other side was a concrete ramp equipped with a rail system and a motorized cart that could transport supplies up to the hospital, or, more grimly, transport bodies down from the hospital. The tunnel served legitimate, innocent purposes. Supplies could be brought up the tunnel even in winter when the steep hill was covered in ice and snow. Staff could use the tunnel as a sheltered passageway, avoiding the need to climb the steep outdoor path. During World War II, the tunnel served as an air raid shelter, but the tunnel's most famous use, the one that earned it the names Death Tunnel and Body Chute, was for removing the bodies of the dead. When a patient died at Waverly Hills, staff would discreetly move the body to the basement level. From there, the corpse would be loaded onto the rail cart and sent down through the tunnel to the bottom of the hill, where a hearse would be waiting to take the body to a funeral home, or, in cases where families could not afford burial, to a place where the body could be cremated or buried in a pauper's grave. This system allowed the staff to remove bodies without other patients seeing, theoretically protecting patient morale by hiding the evidence of death. In practice, of course, the patients knew what was happening. They knew that when someone went into the tunnel, they never came back up. The tunnel might have hidden the physical evidence of death, but it could not hide the reality that people were dying, day after day, in large numbers. The tunnel became a symbol of this death, a dark passage into oblivion, and over the years, it would gain a reputation as one of the most haunted locations within Waverly Hills. For those patients who did recover, or at least improved enough to be released from Waverly Hills, leaving must have been a profound relief, but also a strange transition. They had lived for months or years in this isolated community, disconnected from the outside world. They had formed friendships with other patients, only to see many of those friends die. They had witnessed suffering on a scale difficult to imagine. When they finally walked out the front doors of Waverly Hills, they were entering a world that had moved on without them, a world where people didn't understand what they had experienced. And for those who didn't recover, for the thousands who died at Waverly Hills, their final journey was down through that dark tunnel. One last trip in the place that had become their entire world, a place of suffering and death from which they would never escape. It is little wonder that Waverly Hills became associated with darkness and paranormal activity. The sheer volume of death, the suffering of the patients, the desperation of the staff, and the feeling of hopelessness that must have permeated the walls created an atmosphere that many believe has lingered long after the last patient departed. The cursed fifth floor. The fifth floor of Waverly Hills Sanatorium occupies a unique place in the facility's layout and in its legend. This floor, at the top of the building, was designed with special purposes that set it apart from the other 4 stories. It was here that the most advanced cases of tuberculosis were often housed. Here that the sickest patients came when all other treatment options had been exhausted. And here that some of the darkest stories in Waverly Hills history allegedly took place. The architectural design of the 5th floor differed from the lower floors in significant ways. While the floors below had long corridors lined with private or semi-private patient rooms, the 5th floor had a more open design centered around 2 nurses' stations, positioned strategically to allow staff to monitor patients efficiently. The space included smaller rooms designated for specific purposes, a pantry labeled as Room 501, a linen room designated as Room 503, a medicine room numbered as Room 504, and 2 medium-sized rooms on opposite sides of the nurses' stations, one of which was Room 502 and the other Room 506. The 5th floor featured the heliotherapy department, a space dedicated to treating patients with tuberculosis of the bone. This, particularly devastating form of tuberculosis attacked the skeletal system, causing excruciating pain, deformities, and often permanent disability. The treatment for bone tuberculosis involved extensive exposure to sunlight, and the fifth floor was designed to facilitate this with maximum efficiency. The floor opened out onto a large roof patio, essentially an open terrace where patients could be placed in the direct sun for hours at a time. This roof patio also served as a play area for children being treated at Waverly Hills. The sight of children playing on this rooftop space, children who were suffering from tuberculosis, and many of whom would not survive their illness, must have been both heartbreaking and surreal. Historical accounts suggest that children would play games, including ball games, on this roof patio, trying to maintain some semblance of normal childhood even as they underwent treatment for a deadly disease. The fifth floor was designed with those large windows and solarium spaces that characterized the entire building, allowing for the fresh air circulation that was central to tuberculosis treatment. The floor had the same open-air design as the rest of the building, with patients' beds able to be wheeled out onto the exterior spaces where they would be exposed to the elements. The design philosophy remained consistent. Fresh air and sunshine were the primary weapons against tuberculosis. However, the fifth floor became associated with some of the darkest aspects of Waverly Hills' operation. One persistent legend claims that the fifth floor housed mentally ill tuberculosis patients, those who had been driven insane by their disease or by the trauma of long-term hospitalization. According to these stories, patients with psychiatric problems were segregated on the fifth floor, away from the rest of the hospital population, and that conditions there were particularly grim. These patients allegedly had to approach the half door at the nurses' stations to receive their food, medicine, or permission to use the restroom, treating them more like prisoners than patients. This specific claim about the fifth floor housing mentally ill patients is difficult to verify and is disputed by historians who have studied Waverly Hills. However, the legend persists and has become part of the floor's reputation. What is documented is that patients in the most advanced stages of tuberculosis were sometimes housed on the fifth floor, and these patients would indeed have faced the worst suffering that the disease could inflict. In the final stages of tuberculosis, patients might become delirious from fever, in and out of consciousness, coughing up blood, barely able to breathe, and in constant pain. Caring for these dying patients would have been emotionally and physically exhausting for the nursing staff. The fifth floor's isolation at the top of the building, combined with its association with the sickest patients and its role in bone tuberculosis treatment, gave it an atmosphere distinct from the rest of Waverly Hills. Staff working on the fifth floor would have dealt more directly with death than those on lower floors where patients in earlier stages of disease had better chances of survival. The constant exposure to suffering and death, the isolation and the stress of caring for desperately ill patients created conditions that took a heavy toll on everyone who worked there. It is in this context that the stories of Room 502 must be understood. Room 502 was not a patient room, but rather a functional space associated with one of the fifth floor nurses' stations. The exact purpose of Room 502 varies in different accounts. Some sources describe it as a bathroom, others as a storage space, and still others as a small room used for various purposes. What matters for our story is not the room's original function, but what allegedly happened there, and the reputation it gained as a result. The physical layout of the fifth floor, with its nurses' stations looking out over those two medium rooms, meant that Room 502 was a semi-private space. It was not in the main corridors where patients and visitors constantly passed. It was not in one of the large open solarium areas. It was, instead, a somewhat isolated spot, removed from the bustle of hospital activity, a place where someone seeking privacy might go. This privacy, this isolation, would become significant in the legends of Room 502. The room became associated with two alleged deaths, both of them suicides, both of them involving nurses, both of them shrouded in tragedy and mystery. These deaths, whether they actually occurred as described or not, would transform Room 502 from simply another functional space in a hospital into something darker, a place of despair and violence that would eventually be labeled as the most haunted room in one of the world's most haunted buildings. The fifth floor as a whole gained a reputation for paranormal activity that exceeded even the rest of Waverly Hills. Visitors and paranormal investigators who explored the building after its closure reported numerous experiences on the fifth floor that they could not explain. Disembodied voices have been heard, sometimes whispering, sometimes shouting commands to leave. Shadow figures have been seen moving through the corridors, dark shapes that appear and vanish without explanation. Doors slam shut on their own. Footsteps echo through empty spaces. Visitors have reported feeling sudden, overwhelming emotions, attacks of sadness or despair or anger that seem to come from nowhere and then vanish just as suddenly. The roof patio where children once played has been the site of numerous reports of paranormal activity. Visitors have claimed to hear the sounds of children playing, including the rhythmic chanting of nursery rhymes. The song "Ring Around the Rosie," which in itself has dark historical associations, has been reported by multiple visitors who claim to hear it sung by childlike voices when no children are present. Balls placed on the roof patio have reportedly moved on their own, rolling across the space as though pushed by invisible hands, leading to speculation that the ghost of a child is still trying to play the games they enjoyed in life. But of all the phenomena reported on the fifth floor, nothing compares to the activity associated with Room 502. This room has become the focal point for Waverly Hills' reputation as a haunted location. It is the destination that most visitors want to see. It is the space that paranormal investigation teams focus their equipment and attention on. It is the room where people report the most intense, most unsettling experiences. And at the heart of Room 502's dark reputation are the stories of two nurses and their tragic deaths. Room 502, the legend of Mary Hillenburg. The legend of Room 502 at Waverly Hills Sanatorium begins with a nurse named Mary Hillenburg. According to the story that has been told and retold countless times, amplified through years of retellings by tour guides, paranormal investigators, and curiosity seekers, Mary Hillenburg was a 29-year-old unmarried nurse who worked at Waverly Hills in 1928. She was found dead in Room 502, having allegedly hanged herself from a light fixture or pipe. The reason given for her suicide varies depending on who tells the story, but the most common version involves a pregnancy. The most widely circulated version of the story goes like this. Mary Hillenburg engaged in an affair with one of the doctors at Waverly Hills. This doctor was married, and when Mary discovered she was pregnant with his child, she found herself in a desperate situation. In 1928, unmarried pregnancy carried enormous social stigma. Women who became pregnant outside of marriage faced social ostracism, job loss, and being cut off from their families and communities. For a nurse, a professional woman whose career required respectability, an illegitimate pregnancy could mean complete ruin. According to this version of the story, when Mary told the doctor about the pregnancy, he wanted nothing to do with her. He refused to leave his wife. He refused to claim the child. He may have even threatened to deny the affair entirely, which would have left Mary with no way to prove who the father was. Faced with the shame of unwed motherhood, the loss of her career, and the rejection by the man she presumably loved, Mary fell into despair. On the night of her death, she went to Room 502, fashioned a noose from wire or cord, attached it to a light fixture hanging from the ceiling, and hanged herself. An alternative version of the story adds even darker elements. In this telling, the doctor not only refused to acknowledge the pregnancy, but also attempted to perform an abortion on Mary himself. Abortion was illegal in 1928, and having one performed was dangerous, often resulting in infection, hemorrhage, or death. According to this version, the doctor botched the abortion, and Mary either died during the procedure or in the immediate aftermath. To cover up his involvement and the illegal procedure, the doctor then staged her death to look like a suicide, hanging her body in room 502 to make it appear that she had taken her own life out of despair over the pregnancy. These stories have been repeated so many times that they have taken on the weight of established fact in the minds of many people. Tour guides at Waverly Hills recount the tale. Paranormal investigation shows have featured the story in their episodes. Websites and books about haunted places tell Mary Hillenberg's story as though it is documented history. The legend has become inseparable from Room 502's identity. However, when researchers have attempted to verify the story of Mary Hillenberg, they have encountered significant problems. No death certificate has been found for anyone named Mary Hillenberg dying at Waverly Hills in 1928 or any nearby year. Searches of Kentucky death records reveal that only 2 people with the surname Hillenberg died in Kentucky during the entire period when Waverly Hills operated as a tuberculosis sanatorium, and both died well after 1928, long after Waverly Hills had closed. No obituary for Mary Hillenberg has been found in Louisville newspapers from 1928. No hospital records documenting her employment at Waverly Hills have been discovered. No coroner's report describing her death exists in accessible archives. The absence of documentation is striking because deaths, particularly violent deaths like suicides, generated multiple paper trails. Death certificates were mandatory. Newspapers, especially in the 1920s when suicides were reported with less sensitivity than today, typically printed notices about such deaths, often including sensational details. Coroner's inquests were standard procedure for suspicious deaths. A young, unmarried nurse hanging herself in a tuberculosis sanatorium would have been newsworthy. Yet no contemporary evidence has been found to support the story. The only source that has been cited to support the Mary Hillenberg story was a former Waverly Hills staff member named John Thornberry. According to those who reference him, Thornberry claimed to have knowledge of the suicide and verified the basic details of the story. However, examining Thornberry's own history reveals problems with using him as a source. According to his obituary, John Thornberry was born in 1922. This would have made him only 6 years old in 1928, when Mary Hillenberg supposedly died. Even if he had been at Waverly Hills at that time, which seems unlikely for a 6-year-old, he would not have been privy to the kinds of details that have been included in the legend. More significantly, Thornberry died in 2006, meaning that any accounts attributed to him were recalled decades after the alleged events and cannot be independently verified. The physical details of Room 502 also cast doubt on the hanging story. The room, as it exists today, has no rafters from which someone could hang themselves. The light fixture in the room is mounted on a decorative chain that would not support the weight of an adult human being. There is a pipe running along near the doorway, but this pipe was part of a sprinkler system that was not installed until the 1970s, more than 40 years after Mary Hillenberg's alleged death in 1928. In other words, the physical means by which she supposedly hanged herself did not exist at the time when the hanging allegedly occurred. Despite these problems with verification, despite the lack of documentary evidence, despite the physical impossibilities, the legend of Mary Hillenberg persists. Why? Part of the answer lies in the nature of legend itself. A compelling story, particularly one involving tragic romance, social scandal, desperate choices, and death, has a power that transcends its basis in verifiable fact. The The story of Mary Hillenburg resonates because it touches on themes that feel universally human: love, betrayal, shame, despair, and the tragic consequences of desperate choices. The story also fits too perfectly into the broader narrative of Waverly Hills as a place of suffering and death. The sanatorium was indeed a place where terrible things happened. People did die there in large numbers. The stress on staff was immense. The isolation, the constant exposure to death, the fear of contracting tuberculosis themselves, all of these factors created conditions where tragedy seemed inevitable. The legend of Mary Hillenburg provides a specific, personal tragedy to embody the general atmosphere of suffering that characterized Waverly Hills. Moreover, whether Mary Hillenburg existed or not, whether the story as told is accurate or not, something has given Room 502 its reputation. Multiple independent visitors and investigators have reported unsettling experiences in that room. People have described feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness or despair upon entering. Some have reported hearing a woman's voice, either crying or whispering, or, in some accounts, screaming for help. Others have heard a forceful male voice commanding them to get out as soon as they enter the room. Pregnant women visiting Room 502 have reported particularly intense experiences. Some have felt nauseated or dizzy. Others have described feeling an urgent compulsion to leave, as though something or someone was trying to drive them out of the space. A few have reported feeling an unexplained urge to go to the windows, with some claiming they felt as though something was trying to push them toward the windows or even trying to compel them to jump. These reports, if taken at face value, suggest that something about Room 502 affects visitors in ways that other rooms at Waverly Hills do not. Paranormal investigators have focused considerable attention on Room 502, and many claim to have captured evidence of paranormal activity there. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, recordings reportedly capture whispered words or phrases that were not audible during the actual recording. Electromagnetic field meters, which paranormal investigators use based on the theory that ghosts or spirits create measurable changes in electromagnetic fields, allegedly show unusual spikes in activity in Room 502. Photographs taken in the room sometimes show anomalies such as orbs, light streaks, or shadowy shapes that investigators interpret as evidence of spirits. Temperature readings taken in Room 502 have shown sudden drops, creating cold spots that investigators believe indicate the presence of paranormal entities. Video cameras set up in the room have allegedly captured shadow figures moving past, doors opening or closing on their own, or objects shifting position without visible cause. Some investigators have reported feeling as though they were touched by invisible hands, experiencing sensations of being pushed, pulled, or having their clothing tugged. Those who believe in the haunting of Room 502 offer various theories about what might be happening there. Some believe that if Mary Hillenburg did exist and did die by suicide in that room, her spirit remains trapped there, unable to move on because of the traumatic nature of her death. According to this theory, the feelings of despair and sadness that visitors experience are echoes of Mary's own emotions in her final moments. The voice telling people to get out might be Mary trying to warn others away from the sight of her death, or it might be the voice of the doctor or someone else involved in covering up what really happened. Other theories suggest that regardless of whether the specific Mary Hillenburg story is true, Room 502 may have been the site of other deaths or traumas. Perhaps nurses used that room when they needed a moment alone to break down and cry after losing a patient. Perhaps difficult conversations happened there, moments when patients were told their case was hopeless, or when families were informed of a loved one's death. Perhaps the accumulated emotional energy from years of such moments has somehow imprinted itself on that space, creating a residual haunting that visitors can sense. Skeptics, of course, have alternative explanations for the experiences reported in Room 502. The power of suggestion cannot be discounted. Visitors to Waverly Hills who take ghost tours or participate in paranormal investigations arrive already knowing the story of Room 502. They enter expecting to experience something paranormal, and this expectation can color their perceptions and experiences. Strange shadows might be tricks of light. Cold spots might be drafts in an old, poorly maintained building. Feelings of unease might be natural reactions to being in a dark, decaying space with a reputation for tragedy. The emotional responses people report, the sudden sadness or feelings of despair, could be explained by the general atmosphere of Waverly Hills. Even knowing nothing about the specific legends, a person walking through this abandoned tuberculosis sanatorium, seeing the rusted bed frames and decaying rooms where thousands suffered and died, might naturally feel sad or disturbed. The setting itself evokes death and suffering without requiring any supernatural explanation. The question of what really happened in Room 502 may never be definitively answered. The historical record provides no clear evidence of Mary Hillenburg's existence or death. The physical impossibilities surrounding the alleged hanging cast doubt on the story as traditionally told. Yet the room's reputation persists, supported by numerous contemporary reports of unusual experiences there. Perhaps the truth is that the legend of Room 502 and Mary Hillenburg has become more real, in a certain sense, than any historical facts could be. The story has taken on a life of its own, shaping people's expectations and experiences, becoming part of the mythology of Waverly Hills in a way that transcends questions of literal historical accuracy. Whether Mary Hillenburg existed or not, whether she died in Room 502 or not, the room has become a symbol of all the suffering and death that occurred at Waverly Hills, a focal point for the darkness that many believe still haunts this place. And the story of Room 502 did not end with Mary Hillenburg. According to legend, tragedy struck the room a second time just 4 years later, in 1932, when another nurse allegedly met her death there in circumstances that remain even more mysterious and controversial than the first tragedy. The second death, 1932. Mystery. If the story of Mary Hillenburg in 1928 is shrouded in mystery and difficult to verify, the alleged second death associated with Room 502 in 1932 is even more enigmatic. This second tragedy, according to the legends surrounding Waverly Hills, involved another nurse who worked in or near Room 502 and who met her end not by hanging inside the room, but by falling, or possibly jumping, from the 5th floor roof patio onto the ground far below. The basic story, as it is typically told, goes something like this. In 1932, 4 years after Mary Hillenburg's alleged suicide, another nurse assigned to work on the 5th floor began experiencing psychological difficulties. Some versions suggest she had worked in Room 502 or had been stationed at the nurses' station adjacent to it. According to these accounts, she became increasingly disturbed by her work environment, affected by the constant death, the suffering of patients, or possibly by the alleged haunting associated with Mary Hillenburg's suicide. This nurse's mental state allegedly deteriorated over the weeks or months she worked on the 5th floor. She became withdrawn, depressed, and showed signs of severe psychological distress. Then, one night, she went out onto the 5th floor roof patio, the open terrace where tuberculosis patients underwent heliotherapy and where children had played in the sunshine, and she either jumped or fell to the pavement far below. The fall killed her instantly. Like the Mary Hillenburg story, this account comes with multiple variations. Some versions present the death as clearly a suicide, suggesting that the nurse had been driven to despair by working in close proximity to where Mary Hillenburg died, perhaps even believing that she was being haunted by Mary's ghost. Other versions are more ambiguous, suggesting that the nurse's death might have been an accident rather than a deliberate act. And then there are the darker variations, the ones that whisper of something more sinister than either suicide or accident. According to these versions, the nurse did not jump and did not fall accidentally. Instead, she was pushed. Some accounts suggest she was pushed by a ghostly presence, by the angry or disturbed spirit of Mary Hillenburg, or some other entity that haunted the 5th floor. Other versions hint at human culpability, suggesting that someone, for reasons unknown, pushed the nurse to her death, and that the incident was covered up or dismissed as a suicide to avoid scandal or legal consequences. The exact details of this second death remain frustratingly vague and inconsistent across different accounts. Unlike the Mary Hillenburg story, which at least provides specific details such as a name, an age, a method of death, and a motive, the 1932 incident is often described in only the most general terms. The nurse is usually not named. Her age is not specified. The circumstances leading up to her death are left unclear. Even the date is sometimes given only as 1932 without a specific month or day. This vagueness might seem to suggest that the story is pure invention, a legend created without any factual basis. However, it's worth considering that the lack of specific details could have other explanations. In an era before modern media saturation, before the internet made information easily accessible and permanent, details of tragic events could be lost or forgotten remarkably quickly, especially if those details were deliberately obscured. If a nurse did die in a fall from Waverly Hills in 1932, there might have been strong motivation to keep the story quiet. A suicide on the premises would have been terrible for the sanatorium's reputation, potentially making it harder to recruit nursing staff and possibly alarming the families of current patients. A murder, if that's what it was, would have been even more catastrophic for the institution's image. Hospital administrators might have worked to minimize publicity, perhaps even pressuring the coroner and local newspapers to downplay or not report the incident. It's also possible that records related to this incident were among those lost in the Great Flood of 1937, which destroyed many Louisville documents from the 1920s and 1930s. Without access to death certificates, coroner's reports, or contemporary newspaper accounts, verification becomes nearly impossible. As with the Mary Hillenburg story, attempts to find documentary evidence of this second death have largely come up empty. Researchers have not been able to locate death certificates, obituaries, or coroner's reports that would verify a nurse dying in a fall from Waverly Hills in 1932. No newspaper accounts of such an incident have been found. No hospital records documenting the death or any subsequent investigation have surfaced. Despite the lack of documentation, the story of the second death has become firmly embedded in the Room 502 legend. The notion that two nurses associated with the same room died by suicide within 4 years of each other, or that one committed suicide and the second was driven to madness by the first's ghost, creates a narrative that is dramatically compelling, even if historically unverifiable. The legend gained additional momentum from the various paranormal investigation shows that featured Waverly Hills. These television programs typically presented both deaths as established facts rather than as unverified legends. The show's hosts would recount the stories of Mary Hillenburg's hanging and the 1932 nurse's fall as historical events, using them to set up expectations for the paranormal investigations that followed. Viewers watching these programs would naturally accept these stories as factual, and the legends became further entrenched in popular culture. What is more difficult to explain away, however, are the contemporary reports from people who have experienced something unsettling on the 5th floor roof patio. Multiple visitors and investigators have described feeling uncomfortable or frightened when standing in that space. Some report an inexplicable urge to approach the edge, accompanied by intrusive thoughts about jumping. Others describe feeling as though something is behind them, trying to push them forward toward the drop. These experiences, if genuine and not the result of suggestion or imagination, could have various explanations. From a psychological perspective, standing on a high, open space with a significant drop nearby can create a phenomenon sometimes called high place phenomenon, where people experience brief, unwanted thoughts about jumping. This is a documented psychological experience that affects many people and doesn't require a supernatural explanation. From a paranormal perspective, believers would argue that these experiences represent evidence of the 1932 death. If the nurse was pushed, either by a human or by a supernatural entity, perhaps that violent act left an imprint on the space. Perhaps the traumatic energy of that moment, the terror and shock of falling to one's death, has somehow become embedded in the location, causing sensitive individuals to feel echoes of that original tragedy. Some paranormal investigators have attempted to capture evidence specifically related to the second death. EVP sessions conducted on the roof patio have allegedly produced recordings of female voices, sometimes crying or screaming. Investigators have asked questions aloud, trying to communicate with the spirit of the 1932 nurse, asking her name, asking what happened to her, asking if she jumped or was pushed. Some claim to have received responses through their electronic equipment, though the interpretation of these alleged responses varies widely and remains controversial even within the paranormal investigation community. The story of the second death adds another layer to Room 502's reputation as a cursed location. If one nurse dying there could be viewed as a tragic isolated incident, two deaths involving nurses in the same area within a 4-year span suggests a pattern, a darkness specifically associated with that space. This pattern, real or imagined, has made Room 502 the focal point of paranormal activity at Waverly Hills, the place that investigators focus on, the room that ordinary visitors most want to see, the space that has come to embody all of Waverly Hills' reputation for being haunted. Whether the 1932 death actually occurred or not, whether it was suicide, accident, murder, or something else entirely, the legend has become inseparable from Room 502. Together, the stories of Mary Hillenberg and the unnamed 1932 nurse have transformed a simple functional space in a tuberculosis sanatorium into something else entirely. A symbol of suffering, a portal to the paranormal, a place where death occurred not from disease, but from despair or violence, adding human tragedy to the already overwhelming tragedy of the tuberculosis epidemic itself. And Room 502 was not the only legendary location within Waverly Hills. The building's reputation for paranormal activity extended to other spaces as well, but none more famous or more feared than the dark tunnel that led from the hospital's basement to the bottom of the hill, the passageway known by the grim names of Body Chute and Death Tunnel. The Death Tunnel, journey into darkness. Few places within Waverly Hills Sanatorium evoke as much dread and fascination as the structure known as the Body Chute, or, more ominously, the Death Tunnel. This 500-foot-long passage, descending from the basement level of the hospital to the base of the hill, has become legendary not for any specific death that occurred within it, but for the sheer volume of death it served, for its role in the grim logistics of disposing of the dead during the height of the tuberculosis epidemic. The tunnel was constructed at the same time as the main hospital building, completed in 1926 as part of the comprehensive design of the new Waverly Hills Sanatorium. At its top end, the tunnel connected to the basement level of the hospital where the morgue was located. From there, it descended at an angle, following the contours of the hillside until it reached the bottom where it opened onto a service road near the railroad tracks. The tunnel was built of concrete and designed with two parallel paths. On one side was a set of stairs that staff could use to walk up and down between the hospital and the bottom of the hill. On the other side was a concrete ramp equipped with a rail system and a motorized cart or cable system that could be used to transport items up and down. The tunnel's official purpose was multifaceted and practical. In winter, when the steep hill leading up to the sanatorium was covered in ice and snow, trying to drive supply trucks up to the hospital was difficult and dangerous. The tunnel provided an alternative route. Supplies could be unloaded at the bottom of the hill and sent up through the tunnel on the rail cart, ensuring that the hospital could continue to receive food, medical supplies, and other necessities even in the worst weather. The stairs allowed staff to enter and exit the building without having to brave the elements and climb the steep outdoor path, a convenience during Louisville's harsh winters. During World War II, the tunnel served another purpose. When air raid sirens sounded during civil defense drills, patients and staff would evacuate into the tunnel, using it as a bomb shelter. The concrete construction and the fact that it was mostly underground made it a relatively safe place to take cover. This use of the tunnel, while ultimately unnecessary, given that Louisville was never actually bombed during the war, demonstrates that the structure had legitimate, normal functions. However, the tunnel's most famous and darkest use was for transporting the bodies of the dead. This purpose gave the tunnel its grim nicknames and secured its place in Waverly Hills paranormal legend. Understanding why this tunnel was used for bodies requires understanding the philosophy behind sanatorium treatment and the psychological component of tuberculosis care. Medical authorities in the early 20th century believed that patient morale was crucial to recovery from tuberculosis. They theorized that patients who maintained hope and a positive mental attitude would have better outcomes than those who fell into despair. Whether this theory had any basis in medical fact is debatable, but it shaped hospital policies throughout the sanatorium movement. Administrators at Waverly Hills were acutely aware that the constant presence of death was devastating to patient morale. Watching fellow patients die, seeing bodies removed from rooms, attending funerals or memorial services for those who didn't survive, created an atmosphere of hopelessness that doctors feared would undermine treatment efforts. The solution was to hide death as much as possible. When a patient died, the staff would wait until nighttime or until most other patients were not in a position to observe. The body would be discreetly moved to the basement morgue. From there, rather than bringing the body out through the front entrance of the hospital, where other patients might see, staff would place the corpse on the rail cart and send it down through the tunnel. At the bottom of the hill, a hearse would be waiting to take the body to a funeral home for burial, or in cases where families could not afford proper burial, to be cremated or interred in a pauper's grave. At the height of the tuberculosis epidemic, this process happened with shocking frequency. The most dramatic claims suggest that during the worst years in the 1930s and 1940s, 1 person per hour died at Waverly Hills, which would mean the tunnel was in nearly constant use for body removal. Even more conservative estimates suggest multiple deaths per day. Regardless of the exact numbers, there is no doubt that hundreds or thousands of bodies made their final journey through that tunnel during Waverly Hills' operational years. The psychological impact of the tunnel on the staff who had to use it cannot be overstated. Imagine being an orderly or morgue worker whose job involved taking a dead body, placing it on a cart, and then sending that cart down into a dark, 500-foot-long tunnel, often in the middle of the night. The journey down the tunnel stairs, if you were tasked with accompanying the body or preparing the hearse at the bottom, must have been deeply unsettling. The tunnel was poorly lit at best, completely dark at worst. The concrete walls amplified every sound. Your footsteps echoed. Water dripped from the ceiling and walls, the sound reverberating in the enclosed space. And you were walking alongside or behind a cart carrying a corpse, making a journey that countless dead before had made. For staff who regularly worked with the tunnel, the cumulative effect of this experience must have taken a psychological toll. Even for those who did not believe in ghosts or the supernatural, the constant association with death, The darkness, the isolation, and the sheer repetition of escorting the dead down that passage would have been deeply disturbing. It is little wonder that stories began to circulate among staff about the tunnel being haunted, about seeing shadows that shouldn't be there, about hearing voices or footsteps when no one else was present, about feeling watched or followed in that dark space. After Waverly Hills closed as a tuberculosis sanatorium and sat abandoned for years, the tunnel became a destination for local teenagers and urban explorers. The dark, graffiti-covered passageway with its grim reputation drew those seeking thrills and those interested in the paranormal. Many of these trespassers reported unsettling experiences in the tunnel. They described overwhelming feelings of dread, as though something malevolent was present in the darkness. Some claimed to hear disembodied voices, ranging from whispers to screams. Others reported seeing shadow figures, dark shapes that moved through the tunnel with apparent purpose, sometimes seeming to walk up the stairs as though eternally making that journey from the bottom of the hill back to the hospital. Physical sensations were commonly reported. Visitors described suddenly becoming cold, even on warm days, as though they had walked into a freezer. Some felt as though they were being touched by invisible hands, experiencing sensations of being pushed, pulled, or having their hair or clothing tugged. A few claimed to have been forcefully shoved, hard enough to cause them to stumble or fall, when no one was near them. When Charlie and Tina Mattingly purchased Waverly Hills in 2001 and began restoration work and offering tours, the death tunnel became one of the most popular features for visitors. Paranormal investigation teams focused significant attention on the tunnel, and many claimed to capture evidence of paranormal activity there. EMF meters allegedly showed unusual spikes in electromagnetic fields within the tunnel. Temperature readings revealed cold spots that moved through the space. EVP recordings captured voices, including some that seemed to respond directly to investigators' questions. One of the more unsettling phenomena reported in the death tunnel is the sound of footsteps. Multiple investigators and tour participants have described hearing footsteps in the tunnel when they are certain no one else is present. These footsteps are described as heavy, deliberate, sometimes moving up the stairs from the bottom of the tunnel, sometimes pacing back and forth on the ramp, sometimes seeming to follow investigators as they move through the space. The acoustic properties of the concrete tunnel mean that sounds echo and amplify, but witnesses insist that what they hear are distinct footsteps, not echoes of their own movements or random building noises. Perhaps most dramatically, some visitors have reported being locked inside the tunnel. There are doors at both the top and bottom of the tunnel that can swing closed. According to Tina Mattingly, the owner of Waverly Hills, multiple people over the years, including herself, have experienced having these doors close and apparently lock while they were inside the tunnel, trapping them temporarily. In some cases, the doors had to be forced open from the outside to free those trapped inside. Skeptics might attribute this to old doors with faulty latches combined with air pressure changes, but believers see it as evidence of an intelligent haunting, of spirits deliberately trapping the living in this space of death. The darkness of the tunnel poses practical challenges for investigators and visitors. Flashlights are necessary, but the beams of light create stark contrasts between illuminated and shadowed areas, and peripheral vision in such conditions is unreliable. This creates conditions where pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive patterns like faces in random stimuli, can easily trick the brain into seeing things that aren't there. Shadow figures glimpsed in the darkness might be nothing more than the interplay of light and shadow combined with expectation and suggestion. The tunnel's poor state of repair in its abandoned years added to its unsettling atmosphere. Water leakage created puddles and streams running down the walls and floor. Mold and mildew grew in the damp conditions. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it innocuous tagging, some of it darker imagery, including occult symbols and threatening messages. The air was thick and damp, carrying the smell of rot and decay. Walking through the tunnel required careful footing on the uneven, slippery surfaces. The experience was physically uncomfortable even before any consideration of paranormal elements. Restoration work on the tunnel in more recent years has improved some of these conditions, but the death tunnel remains one of the most atmospherically oppressive spaces in Waverly Hills. Standing at the top, looking down that long, dark passage descending into blackness, knowing that countless dead made this journey, creates a profound psychological impact. Standing at the bottom and looking up, seeing the tunnel stretching up into the hospital above, creates an equally powerful feeling, a sense of the weight of history and death literally hanging over you. The tunnel has been featured prominently in paranormal investigation television shows. Ghost hunters captured what they claimed was a full-bodied shadow figure in the tunnel during their investigation. Ghost Adventures documented their own experiences there, including EVP recordings and what they described as hostile encounters with entities that seemed to try to drive them out. Numerous other shows and countless independent investigation teams have spent time in the death tunnel, and the cumulative effect of all these investigations has been to further cement the tunnel's reputation as one of the most haunted locations within Waverly Hills. A 2005 horror film titled Death Tunnel was based on the legend of this passageway, though the film took considerable creative liberties with both the actual history of Waverly Hills and the reported paranormal phenomena. The film's existence, regardless of its quality or historical accuracy, reflects how deeply the death tunnel had penetrated into popular culture as a symbol of Waverly Hills' dark legacy. The truth about the death tunnel may never be fully known. Did ghosts of the dead linger in this passageway, trapped in some way by the trauma of their deaths and the indignity of being secretly removed through a hidden tunnel? Or is the tunnel simply a dark, atmospheric space where suggestion, expectation, and environmental factors combine to create experiences that people interpret as paranormal? The answer likely depends on one's willingness to believe in the supernatural. But regardless of belief, the death tunnel remains a powerful symbol of Waverly Hills history, a physical manifestation of the scale of death that occurred in this place, and of the administration's futile attempt to hide that death from the living. Conclusion: the legacy of Room 502 and the call to explore. As we reach the end of our journey through the dark history of Waverly Hills Sanatorium and the cursed legend of Room 502, we must ask ourselves what lessons this place holds for us and why its story continues to resonate so powerfully with people around the world. Room 502 began as simply a functional space in a hospital, a bathroom adjacent to a nurse's station on the 5th floor of a tuberculosis sanatorium. It had no special significance, no inherent darkness. It was just a room. But according to legend, it became the site of tragedy not once, but twice, transforming from a mundane space into something darker, a place associated with despair, death, and possibly the supernatural. Whether the stories of Mary Hillenberg and the second nurse are historically accurate or not, whether their spirits truly haunt Room 502 or not, the room has become a powerful symbol. It represents the human cost of the tuberculosis epidemic, the suffering of healthcare workers who gave their lives to caring for the sick, and the desperation that isolation and constant exposure to death could create. It embodies the tragedy of lives cut short, of potential unfulfilled, of death coming not from disease, but from despair or violence. The broader story of Waverly Hills reminds us of a time when tuberculosis was America's most feared disease, when an entire sanatorium movement arose to combat this plague, and when tens of thousands of people suffered and died from an infection that we can now treat with a course of antibiotics. It reminds us that medical progress is not inevitable or guaranteed, that diseases that seem conquered can return, and that we should never take our health or the availability of effective medical treatment for granted. Waverly Hills also serves as a memorial to the tuberculosis patients who lived and died there. Their names are largely forgotten, their individual stories lost to time, but the building stands as a testament to their struggle. For the thousands who died at Waverly Hills, whether from tuberculosis during the sanatorium years or from neglect and abuse during the Woodhaven era, the building represents their final home, the place where they drew their last breaths. In remembering Waverly Hills, we remember them. The paranormal aspect of Waverly Hills, whether one believes in ghosts or not, serves a purpose in keeping this history alive. The ghost stories draw visitors who might never otherwise learn about tuberculosis, about the sanatorium movement, about the medical and social history embodied in this building. The tours educate as they entertain. The paranormal investigations, for all their controversial aspects, keep the building in the public consciousness and generate the funds necessary for its preservation. Room 502 specifically has become a focal point for this intersection of history, tragedy, and the supernatural. It represents the darkest aspects of Waverly Hills, the place where the suffering allegedly became too much to bear, where nurses driven to desperation took their own lives or met violent ends. The room draws visitors seeking encounters with the paranormal, but in entering that space, they are also confronting the weight of history, the reality of the suffering that occurred throughout this building. The question of whether Waverly Hills is truly haunted may ultimately be less important than what the building represents and the conversations it generates. It forces us to think about death, suffering, and what happens to the energy or essence of people who die in traumatic circumstances. It challenges us to consider whether consciousness might persist beyond death in some form. It invites us to confront our own mortality and our feelings about what might lie beyond. For those who visit Waverly Hills and experience something they cannot explain, whether in room 502, the death tunnel, or elsewhere in the building, the experience can be profound and life-changing. Whether they encountered genuine spirits of the dead, or whether their experiences had natural explanations, the emotional and psychological impact is real. The building creates a space where people feel connected to history, to tragedy, and possibly to something beyond our normal understanding of reality. The legend of Room 502 will continue to evolve as more people visit, as more investigations are conducted, as more experiences are reported. The story will be told and retold, with details shifting and changing with each telling, as legends do. Mary Hillenberg, whether she truly existed or not, will remain a central figure in the paranormal mythology of Waverly Hills, her tragic story serving as the foundation for the room's dark reputation. As we conclude this exploration of Room 502 and Waverly Hills Sanatorium, we are left with a place that defies simple categorization. It is a historical site, a medical landmark, an architectural treasure, and according to many, one of the most haunted locations on Earth. It is a place of tragedy and suffering, but also a place of hope, where thousands of tuberculosis patients received care during an era when care was all that medicine could offer. It is a place that died twice, first when the tuberculosis hospital closed, and again when the Woodhaven Geriatric Center was shuttered. And it is a place that has been resurrected through the efforts of preservationists who recognized its value. The dark corridors of Waverly Hills hold stories beyond counting. Every patient room witnessed suffering and sometimes death. Every corridor echoed with the coughs of the dying and the footsteps of devoted staff. The death tunnel carried thousands to their final rest. The fifth-floor roof patio saw children playing in the sunshine, trying to be children even as disease ravaged their small bodies. And Room 502, that cursed space that has captured so much attention, allegedly witnessed tragedy that transformed it from a simple bathroom into a place of legend. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, whether you think Waverly Hills is genuinely haunted, or simply a creepy old building with dramatic history, there is no denying the power of this place. It stands as a monument to human suffering and human resilience, to the failures of medicine and its eventual triumphs, to death and to the hope of life beyond. The Gothic structure on its hill overlooking Louisville remains a powerful presence, drawing the living to contemplate death, drawing those seeking the paranormal to seek evidence of the supernatural, and drawing historians and preservationists to ensure that the lessons of Waverly Hills are not forgotten. If you find yourself drawn to Waverly Hills, if you wish to walk those corridors and stand in room 502, if you want to descend into the death tunnel and experience for yourself what so many others have reported, the opportunity exists. The Mattingleys and the Waverly Hills Historical Society continue to offer tours and investigations, but approach with respect. Remember that Waverly Hills is not merely a haunted house attraction or a paranormal theme park. It is a place where real people suffered and died, where healthcare workers dedicated their lives to fighting a terrible disease, and where the weight of history hangs heavy in the air. Stand in room 502 and remember Mary Hillenberg, whether she lived or not, and the second nurse whose name we do not even know. Remember the suffering that tuberculosis caused. Remember the isolation that patients endured. Remember the fear that must have gripped the nurses and doctors who worked there, knowing that every cough might mean infection. Every day might be their last healthy day before the disease claimed them too. Walk through the death tunnel and think of the thousands who made that final journey down into darkness. Their bodies are long gone, buried or cremated, but the path they took remains, that 500 feet of concrete corridor serving as a memorial to the scale of death that occurred at Waverly Hills. The story of Waverly Hills Sanatorium and the cursed Room 502 is ultimately a human story. It is a story of disease and death, yes, but also of care and dedication. It is a story of medical advancement, of how far we have come from the days when tuberculosis was a death sentence. It is a story of historical preservation, of people who saw value in saving this building when others wanted to tear it down. And for those who believe, it is a story of spirits who remain, unable or unwilling to move on from the place where they spent their final days, still walking the corridors, still trapped in room 502, still making that final journey down through the death tunnel. The legend endures. Room 502 remains. Waverly Hills stands. And the spirits, if they exist, continue to wait in the darkness for visitors brave enough to seek them out, to hear their stories, and to perhaps carry a piece of that darkness away when they leave. The cursed room on the 5th floor calls to those drawn to the paranormal, inviting them to experience its darkness for themselves, to stand where Mary Hillenberg allegedly stood in her final desperate moments, and to perhaps encounter something that science cannot explain. This is the legacy of Room 502 at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. This is the story that continues to unfold with each new visitor, each new investigation, each new report of something unexplained encountered within those walls. The past is not dead here. It is not even past. It lives on in the stories we tell, in the experiences people report, and in the brooding presence of that Gothic structure standing sentinel over Louisville, keeping its secrets, harboring its ghosts, and waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to enter its doors and seek out the truth of what haunts the cursed Room 502. If this story has intrigued you, if you find yourself drawn to the dark history and alleged hauntings of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, I encourage you to explore further. Visit the Waverly Hills Historical Society website to learn about tour options and to book your own visit if you dare. Read more about the tuberculosis epidemic and the sanatorium movement to understand the historical context that created places like Waverly Hills. Watch the numerous paranormal investigation shows that have featured the location to see the evidence they captured and form your own opinions about what it might mean. Most importantly, remember the human beings whose suffering and death created this legend. Waverly Hills is not just a spooky location or a paranormal playground. It is a place where real tragedies occurred, where thousands lived out their final days, and where the boundary between past and present sometimes seems dangerously thin. Approach it with the respect it deserves. Honor the memory of those who died there. And perhaps, if you are very brave, stand in room 502 in the darkness and listen for the whispers of history echoing through that cursed space. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of America's darkest and most fascinating locations. The story of Waverly Hills and Room 502 is a story that continues to be written with each new day, each new visitor, and each new encounter with whatever lingers in that Gothic building on the hill. The legacy of the White Plague lives on, and the spirits of Waverly Hills, whether real or imagined, ensure that we never forget the terrible toll that tuberculosis once took and the suffering endured by those who fought against it, both as patients and as the healthcare workers who cared for them. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay safe if you choose to explore the haunted halls of Waverly Hills Sanatorium and the cursed Room 502 for yourself. The darkness there is deep, the history is heavy, and what you might encounter is something you will have to discover on your own. Remember Room 502. Remember Waverly Hills. Remember the dead who cannot be forgotten. End of script. Final word. Count, approximately 18,500 words. Estimated video runtime, 2+ hours. This comprehensive documentary script is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. All information presented is based on documented historical records, where available, and clearly labeled folklore, where verification is not possible. Viewers are encouraged to approach the paranormal claims with critical thinking, while respecting the genuine historical tragedy that occurred at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Epilogue. Visiting Waverly Hills today. For those inspired by this dark history to visit Waverly Hills Sanatorium in person, the experience awaits. The facility, located at 4400 Paralee Drive in Louisville, Kentucky, is open for various types of tours throughout most of the year. Understanding what to expect and how to prepare can enhance your experience, whether you're primarily interested in the historical aspects, the paranormal phenomena, or simply the atmosphere of this remarkable place. The Historical Society offers several types of tours. The daytime historical tour, typically lasting about 2 hours, focuses on the tuberculosis history, the architecture of the building, and the medical practices of the sanatorium era. Knowledgeable guides lead groups through the 5 floors, explaining the purpose of different areas, sharing historical photographs, and discussing the lives of patients and staff. This tour is ideal for history enthusiasts, students, or those who want to learn about the building without the paranormal emphasis. The paranormal tour, conducted after dark, lasts approximately 2 hours and takes visitors through the building with the lights dimmed or off, creating an atmosphere conducive to paranormal experiences. Guides share the ghost stories, legends, and reported phenomena associated with different areas. This tour includes visits to Room 502, the Death Tunnel, and other hotspots for alleged paranormal activity. Visitors are allowed to take photographs and use recording devices, and many bring their own paranormal investigation equipment. For the most dedicated ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts, overnight investigations are available. These extended experiences, typically lasting 6 to 8 hours, allow small groups to explore the building at their own pace throughout the night. Participants can set up their own equipment, conduct EVP sessions, and spend extended time in locations like Room 502 and the Death Tunnel. A guide and security staff remain on the property, but allow investigators considerable freedom to explore. These overnight investigations book up months in advance and are considered by many paranormal investigators to be bucket list experiences. Waverly Hills also hosts special events throughout the year, including the Halloween haunted house attraction known as the Waverly Hills Haunted House, which transforms parts of the building into a theatrical horror experience while maintaining respect for the building's history. There are also paranormal investigation training workshops, historical lectures, and other special programming. When planning a visit to Waverly Hills, several practical considerations should be kept in mind. The building is in a state of partial restoration. While significant work has been done to make it safe for tours, it remains an old structure with uneven floors, stairs without handrails in some areas, and spaces that can be physically challenging to navigate. Comfortable, closed-toe shoes are essential. The building can be cold even in warm weather, so layered clothing is recommended. For paranormal tours or overnight investigations, bring flashlights with fresh batteries, as much of the building will be dark. Photography is permitted and encouraged. The building offers extraordinary opportunities for both historical documentation and artistic photography. The decay, the play of light through broken windows, the graffiti-covered walls, and the architectural details all create compelling images. For those interested in paranormal photography, many visitors capture what they believe are anomalous images, though skeptics would attribute most of these to normal photographic artifacts. If you're bringing paranormal investigation equipment, standard tools include EMF meters, digital voice recorders for EVP sessions, temperature guns or sensors, and video cameras. Infrared cameras are particularly popular for overnight investigations. However, remember that Waverly Hills is a popular investigation site precisely because phenomena are reported even by visitors with no equipment, so elaborate gear is not necessary to have an experience. Respect for the location is paramount. Waverly Hills is not a playground or a place to vandalize or disturb. It is a historical site and a memorial to those who suffered and died there. Visitors are expected to behave appropriately, follow guide instructions, and treat the building with the reverence it deserves. Disrespectful behavior can result in removal from the property. The question many potential visitors ask is whether Waverly Hills is safe. From a physical safety standpoint, the answer is generally yes, provided you follow safety guidelines, watch your step, stay with your group, and follow staff instructions. From a paranormal standpoint, the overwhelming majority of reported experiences are non-threatening. Most phenomena reported at Waverly Hills involve seeing or hearing things, not physical attacks or danger. However, some visitors have reported feeling pushed or touched, and a very small number of people have reported scratches or other marks appearing on their skin. Whether you experience anything paranormal during your visit or not, the experience of walking through Waverly Hills is profound. The building is a physical connection to history, a place where you can stand in the same spaces where thousands of tuberculosis patients spent their final days. You can walk the death tunnel that carried countless dead to their final rest. You can stand in room 502 and contemplate the legends that have made it famous. You can feel the weight of history in every corridor, every abandoned patient room, every piece of rusted medical equipment that remains. For many visitors, whether they believe in ghosts or not, Waverly Hills evokes strong emotional responses. The sadness of so much suffering and death, the respect for the healthcare workers who dedicated themselves to fighting tuberculosis, the wonder at how far medical science has progressed, and the awe at the scale and ambition of this Gothic structure all combine to create an experience that stays with you long after you leave. The work of preserving and restoring Waverly Hills continues. Every ticket purchased, every tour taken, every donation made contributes to the ongoing effort to stabilize the building, prevent further deterioration, and eventually complete a full restoration that will preserve this important piece of medical and architectural history for future generations. By visiting, you become part of that preservation effort, and help ensure that the stories of Waverly Hills and the people who lived and died there will not be forgotten. So if you find yourself drawn to this dark history, if the legend of Room 502 calls to you, if you want to walk the death tunnel and experience for yourself what has made Waverly Hills famous, the opportunity awaits. Book your tour, make your plans, and prepare yourself for an experience that will challenge your perceptions, educate you about an important chapter in medical history, and perhaps, just perhaps, give you a glimpse into something beyond our normal understanding of the world. Waverly Hills Sanatorium stands waiting, its secrets held close, its legends growing with each passing year. The cursed Room 502 remains on that 5th floor, drawing the curious and the brave. The death tunnel descends into darkness, its walls echoing with the footsteps of the countless dead who made that final journey. And somewhere in those Gothic corridors, whether in physical reality or in the collective imagination or in some realm we don't yet understand, the spirits of Waverly Hills continue their eternal vigil, waiting for those brave enough to seek them out and to bear witness to their stories. The legacy of Room 502, the memory of the tuberculosis epidemic, the preservation of this remarkable building, all depend on people caring enough to visit, to learn, and to share these stories. By engaging with the history and the legends of Waverly Hills, by approaching the subject with both critical thinking and open-minded curiosity, we honor those who suffered there and ensure that their experiences, their lives, and their deaths have meaning and are not forgotten. This is Waverly Hills. This is Room 502. This is the Death Tunnel. This is a place where history lives, where legends are born, and where, according to many, the dead refuse to rest. Your journey through its dark corridors awaits, should you choose to take it.